and ovation. PapaGee Few versus LFB. Come on up here, walk up here. PapaGee Few with tradition. Are you ready?
We shall see.
Write Club audience, are you ready? PapaGee Few with tradition in 3, 2, 1, begin.
Tradition. Last Saturday night, I spent several hours sitting near a fire pit in a good friend's backyard with other good friends. As I watched the flames and enjoyed the conversations, I thought about the multitude of people throughout prehistory who must have spent their evenings doing much the same thing. Archaeologists tell us that our ancestors were building communal fires at least 400,000 years ago, maybe even 1,000,000 years. Most of our ancestors in those small hunting and gathering bands must have been closely related by blood, but I'm sure many of them were also connected by friendship. I'm also sure that's a large part of how they survived to pass on their genes to the likes of us. The word tradition more often describes the practices of particular cultures rather than the behavior of our species as a whole. For instance, human rituals involve many different ways to prepare food or to fast, to wear clothes or take them off, to marry or divorce, and to believe or disbelieve ideas about how we all came to be. But in this case, the available evidence tells us that the tradition of building communal fires has been so ancient and widespread among human groups that it might have become a genetically transmitted behavior pattern, maybe even our oldest, most universal, and most successful one. Last week, when I mentioned what I'd be talking about here tonight, one of my friends near that fire recommended a book published a couple of years ago, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. It sounded relevant, so I started reading it on Kindle after I went home that night. I haven't finished reading it yet, but I'm not disappointed so far. Among many other things, the authors discuss two competing views about the essential nature of our species. On one hand, the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes argued in the 17th century that before we invented agriculture and cities and absolute monarchs, our natural state was a war of all against all, and that our lives were solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes had much to say about fire, but it was mostly about how threats of eternal fire served to keep our innate cruelty, corruption, and callousness somewhat in check. If he'd known about our prehistoric tradition of communal fires, he probably would have said that our ancestors gathered around them in the night because the flames discouraged the other monsters they wanted to kill and eat us before we could get around to killing and eating each other. On the other hand, there's the noble savage ideal, often attributed to the 18th century writer Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He contended that civilization involves a hopeless race to discover remedies for the evils it produces. He viewed property rights as foremost among those evil products, declaring that the fruits of the earth belong to us all and the earth itself to nobody. As for organized religion, he wrote, "I had been brought up in a church which decides everything and permits no doubts, so that having rejected one article of faith, I was forced to reject the rest." But for all their differences, both Hobbes and Rousseau believed that we're naturally solitary creatures. And it's not surprising they believed that, because they lived in times and places heavily influenced by the belief that we're all descended from one man who was alone until God made a woman from one of his ribs as an afterthought. That belief was traditional, of course, and it hasn't completely died out yet. But for all its importance throughout many centuries, it's only one manifestation of our general ability to have ideas about the world in which we live and about ourselves. I like to think that throughout prehistory it was our tradition to exchange ideas of all kinds around evening fires. I'm sure many of those ideas were innovative in practical ways, involving improvements in stone chipping, fire pit cookery, hide tanning, etc. But I also like to think that some of those prehistoric discussions were about more abstract matters, such as the value of honesty, the nature of love, and the desirability of peace. Overall, I like to think that during those evolutionary eons, we used fire for constructive purposes much more often than we threatened to burn others if they didn't accept our ideas, and much more often than we concentrated the heat to forge weapons of war. If that were not the case, in view of our proven ability to destroy each other and ourselves, I doubt we'd have survived as a species for this long. And if that were not the case, I fear that the only innovation that might save us in the future would be universal genetic modification. And who'd volunteer for that? Who'd trust it? And how totalitarian would our civilization have to be to make everyone submit to it? Playing God in that way might prove even more destructive and repressive than any collective conviction that some particular religion or anti-religion is the only true one. One last thought, although there's not much archaeological evidence to support this idea, I suspect that soon after our ancestors learned to build communal fires, they also learned to use them to facilitate inhaling herbal remedies for some of the less pleasant aspects of the human condition. And fire can also aid the processing of some liquids which perform related functions. Not saying I was under the influence of any such substance last Saturday night. As I sat with friends around that fire pit, not saying I wasn't either, just saying that I didn't feel as much desire as I sometimes do to alter my mind and mood with such, maybe because it already felt so good, to honor a tradition that's written not in some latter-day book of legends, but rather deep within our DNA.
PapaGee Few with tradition.